When the church I was working at really began to blow up and we were reaching people and people were joining from around the world and we began to visit those locations, Pastor Pierre would bring me with him. So I would sit with pastors around the country and in India and South Africa and Mexico, wherever we were going. And I began to hear and just feel this tension. I didn't know at the beginning that it was loneliness, but at times it almost felt just like a frustration. There's just so much frustration. And at first I thought it was just a lack of work-life balance, and then I just began to think, well, it's just what the cost is of ministry.
What kinds of things would you hear?
Welcome to the Shepherd's Podcast, a podcast by pastors for pastors, designed to be a communal space where relationships and resources bring refreshing and renewal to those who shepherd and lead congregations. Connect with us and check out more episodes and resources at theshepherdsnetwork.com.
Welcome to the Shepherd's Podcast. It is great to have you with us today. And today our subject is something that is dear to my heart because I've experienced it. I've experienced when I have it and when I haven't had it. And it's something that every pastor deals with. In fact, in all of my work with shepherds and pastors across the country, in our own region, wherever we are, I hear this more than anything else. And from pastors, from their wives, and that is this, Pastor, the ministry is lonely. I am lonely. I feel all alone. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. And I just know that God has something better for us as shepherds than to live our lives lonely. And while it's true that leadership is lonely, and that very often it reduces the circle of people that can know us in the most intimate way, it is really important for us to get relationship right. Because when we begin to isolate, or we feel that we have no one to talk to, it becomes a breeding ground for the enemy. Satan uses that to not only play with our minds, but to tempt us to do things to try to satisfy that longing in our soul. And yes, Jesus is there to meet those needs, but the truth is Jesus provided people. And as shepherds, we need to know who are the people God's called into our life, who are the safe people that we can build relationships with, and how do we properly use those relationships. And today with me, to help me talk about this, is a very dear friend, a man who's done a lot of work in the body of Christ. He's been a youth pastor, he's been a volunteer in the church, he's been a campus pastor, an executive pastor for a mega church in upstate New York, and he is now a consultant for pastors and leaders all over the country. And that's my good friend, Chris Folwell. Chris, it's great to have you with us today.
It's great to be with you, Pastor.
Chris, talk a little bit about your story, kind of just briefly, how you came to the place that you are today.
Yeah, so I began attending youth group at a church in Rochester that at the time was called New Creation Fellowship. I came to Christ as a teen. My parents came to Christ when I was about a senior in high school. So church became an all-in experience for my whole family when I was in my late teen years because it was new. And it was exciting, and to experience God corporately and to be introduced to anything that had to do with the Spirit of God was nothing we had ever known. So I started attending that youth group, started bringing friends to youth group. That was exciting. And then did a first stint in Bible school before I went back to seminary and came back to that church just eager to do anything. And there was a youth pastor there at the time that was planning on transitioning. His parents were missionaries over in Kenya. He really wanted to get back to Kenya or to helping his parents. So the pastor, Pastor Pierre, said to me, well, if you're willing to hang around, I think in time, the current youth pastor is going to head back home, or he's going to head to help his parents. There was no timeline. It was just if you're willing to stick around. So Tanya and I had been married a couple of years. I was working for her father at the time, went part-time, and just started hanging around the church. Eventually, the youth pastor did move on to help his parents, and I believe is still in that role, building that missions work with his parents. And it was a really rough start because I knew nothing about church leadership. I really knew not a whole lot about church. So the pastor, the lead pastor, hired a consultant just to help me understand, a local guy that had built a really large, influential youth ministry. It took about a year just to get my act together. Actually watching him do leadership meetings, watching him recruit leaders. And then when this consultant felt I was ready, I stepped in. And when we started in that ministry, we had 9 students. And then the Lord did a really unique work there where we ended up reaching 250 students weekly.
That's amazing.
And then we
Every
did
week?
Every week.
Wow.
And we built a youth facility. The elders and the lead pastor decided to just rip down a upper part of the wing of the church. There was multiple classrooms, and that became 3 to 4 years of learning how to minister to youth. We had a very diverse youth group on the west side of Rochester, which was fun. A lot of kids that did not know Jesus. A lot of kids.
So a lot of evangelization and
a lot of that, and a lot of deep ministry.
That's awesome.
A lot of pain in the lives of those youth, and that went on to. We built a gorgeous facility across the street, about 50,000 square foot facility. We purchased 60 acres across the street. And at that time, I was put in charge of volunteer ministry. So it was essentially recruiting and training the leaders. Went from having 3, for all of those listening that have done this, went from having 3 greeters to needing 12.
Yeah.
Went from having 3 ushers to needing 16.
had to scale.
Yes.
Yeah.
And had to recruit different types of leaders. For me, it was now learning how to work with adults. I actually remember vividly the first time sitting with adults versus young adult leaders and how insecure and fearful I felt, because these were people that had lives and careers and
Right.
had built things. And so did that. And then I just began to help with all ministries around the church to help us adjust to the new building. And we quickly grew to several services in that new facility. And our pastor wanted to reach the downtown community in Rochester, so put me on assignment to discover a location. He had a few in mind, but to really find a location. So we rented a theater in the upstairs in an old Episcopal church in downtown Rochester, and we ended up renovating their lower level basement, which was a bomb shelter, that became a food pantry, which still operates today. And we had Saturday night church there in that theater for about 3 years.
So this would be the second venue of the mother church. So
Yes,
it was like
yes,
a
yes.
multi-site. This was your first, second site.
Yep.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned to you prior to the podcast here, Warren Bird partnered with us to just help us understand how to make this happen. So for everyone,
A great guy.
anyone listening, anything he writes on multi-site is just genius. So he was helping us along the way to make sure we did it right, from a financial standpoint, from a team standpoint. So then eventually the Episcopal Church allowed us to start holding a Sunday service, which they didn't for several years. So then we were running 2 Saturday nights and 1 Sunday. And then we employed a pastor to take that over. And I was sent to launch a venue across the street from our original location. Because there were so many people there, we wanted to offer. Seacoast Church at the time was doing like the multiple venue, multiple different types of music. So we were going to do that across the street, so I started that. Then I ended up coming back to be the campus pastor of the original location, because now the lead pastor had multiple locations, and we were with TBN South Africa, because as you know, Pastor Pierre is from South Africa.
We're talking about our good friend Pierre Duplessis.
Yes, yes.
Who pastors a great church in Rochester, the Father's House.
Yes,
And
yes.
has been my friend for probably 12, 15 years. Great man.
And then just in closing, because this was 17 years, so it was a long journey for myself at the Father's House, we wanted to launch what was our significant investment in a second location. So in Greece, New York, we launched a 25,000 square foot facility, which was about 11 miles away. And I was part of helping with that. We ended up sending someone else, and I would eventually be assigned to that location a couple years into it being developed. And then would land in my last few years on staff at the Father's House on what was an incredible executive team, because we were at the point where we were hiring people from the industry or from corporate world who really loved Jesus to help us. So I got to experience what it was like to be on an executive team that had just people of diverse backgrounds, work experience, resumes. And the all-in executive team experience with Pastor Pierre and the team was really the last 3 or 4 years that I was on staff there.
Okay. All right. And we talk about relationships, and of course now you're doing consulting, you're leading a large ministry in Rochester that works with the poor,
Yes.
provides
yes,
food. Do you want to talk about
nonprofit.
that briefly, just a little bit?
Yes, when Pastor Pierre and I both, it was about a 3-year journey of us both sensing that the Lord was calling me and my family to other things. And when I did resign, I accepted a position directing a nonprofit in Rochester called the Center for Hope. It had a very established food pantry. I'm connected with Hope Lutheran Church, but it is a separate 501c3. So we have a shopping center where we provide food to about 1,000 people per month. We do employment and financial counseling, and this year we're beginning full primary medical care. We're partnering with Jericho Road out of Buffalo, New York, who will be setting up their first Rochester site with us to offer, and they specialize in medical care for the marginalized and the poor.
That's great.
Which was always the founding pastor of Center for Hope, Pastor Kirk Duker, that was always his heart, to offer high-level medical care for those that don't always get the best attention in medical settings.
So let's talk a little bit about, that's your experience where you've been. Our topic today is building life-giving relationships.
Yes.
As a pastor.
Yes.
Have you noticed that it's difficult? Have you noticed what I started with today, that pastors are often lonely and isolated? And what has been your experience of seeing isolation in ministry in your various experiences?
Well, when the church I was working at really began to blow up and we were reaching people and people were joining from around the world, and we began to visit those locations, Pastor Pierre would bring me with him. So I would sit with pastors around the country and in India and South Africa and Mexico, wherever we were going, and I began to hear and just feel this tension. I didn't know at the beginning that it was loneliness, but at times it almost felt just like a frustration. There's just so much frustration. And at first I thought it was just a lack of work-life balance, and then I just began to think, well, it's just what the cost is of ministry.
What kinds of things would you hear?
Just unhappy. You know, it was just a general sense of you're sitting with individuals who are reaching so far,
Yep.
and who on the outside are wildly successful. Any of us would want to be around these people. But when you're sitting in the restaurant and when you're talking and it's private and it's personal, it's not the happiness that you experience when you're in the front row at the conference or when you're in the green room.
Right.
And to me, that was still new, so I was processing it. And I was also beginning to pick up on a lot of that in me. Though I was not a lead pastor, as I was given privilege to these spaces, I was feeling just the stirring in me of a deep dissatisfaction, even though I was doing everything I'd always dreamt of doing. You know, ministering and preaching and seeing lives transformed, but there was a vacancy.
So what was that vacancy?
Well, as I've shared with you, Pastor, it really wasn't until I went back to seminary, through Palmer Eastern Seminary in Philly, and we had a semester on biblical community, koinonia. It was during that time of a deep dive into the scripture, and our professor would have us do some very practical things, like go make friends or evaluate the current status of your friendships. And through my friendship with my closest friend, Pastor Wayne Francis, where he began to press into me about it, that I realized my theology of friendship had really become a theology of work. Because when church was growing so fast, and you know, you always need more staff, I was always prayerfully recruiting individuals, and all of my relationships had become around work, doing great work.
So they were transactional, really, relationships.
At the time, I didn't see it that way because we were up late nights, we were praying together,
Sure.
We're building things, we're building systems and structures, we're praying for
Having
people.
fun.
Yeah, we're laughing, we're crying. But I did not have a place where I could talk about the real depths of the brokenness of my marriage because I was never home. I didn't have a place I could talk about not growing up with a Christian dad and actually not knowing how to parent my kids in a Christian way. I was talking to parents about how to raise their kids, but actually very uncomfortable praying with my kids at night because I didn't have anyone to talk to about it besides Pastor Pierre, who was also my boss.
Right.
Which is the conundrum.
That's the conundrum. How do you build relationships when you have multiple levels of relationship, multiple hats that you wear? And in ministry, you want to be relational and close to the people that you work with and the people you're serving.
Yes, of course.
But there are levels of intimacy. And the truth is, there's only so much that your sheep can handle, even your
Yes.
highest level sheep.
Yes. Yes.
Right? Because, and this is something that helped me. My journey came to a place where I felt lonely, and I went to a retreat that was really designed around looking at what you felt as a leader was deficient and developing a plan to deal with that. And the retreat was centered around people sitting in groups talking and sharing with each other. And when I began talking with my group about just my daily life, what I was doing, I was watching the responses of the people in the group, and they felt a lot of compassion for the challenges that I was facing, but they had to call out the fact that, all the people in your life call you pastor. And I said, I had to think about it. It's true. I've got a couple of folks that I consider friends that are members of this church, but I'm also their shepherd.
Yes.
And it does complicate the relationship. And they pointed out, in fact, I was talking to John Townsend, who led this particular group and was kind of the founder of this. And he said, you need people in your life that don't need anything from you.
Wow, that's well said.
So if in my case, I've got all of my congregation, right? They need something from me. I've got my employees, even my top executive level employees that I do life with, but I do more life around ministry with them. And again, they need something from me, right?
Yes.
I have a nonprofit that I lead in the city that does works of service for the community, but everybody in those relationships look to me as a pastor. And even in my own community, because I've been doing this work for so long, because we have maybe a larger church, the community itself looks to me in some capacity as a leader.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Who do you have in your life that doesn't need something from you? Even a lot of the pastors I had relationships with look to me as their pastor or as their coach or as their mentor. So you want to be open, honest, and transparent, but the fact is people that look to you in leadership in some capacity can only handle so much of that and still maintain the purity of the reason for your relationship. And I realized I had a total deficit of relationship with people in my life that was not complicated by several other hats that we were wearing.
Wow.
Coworker or pastor or employer, something,
Yes.
even family, because I have family members who I employ. And you wear multiple levels of hats, multiple levels of relationships, and you have to switch hats. And I realized my relationships were complicated because there were, most of them had complications to them. And then they challenged me, who are the people in your life that can get in the tank with you?
Yeah.
Can get down, get down and sit with you in life
That's it.
and don't need anything from you. And you don't need anything from them. They're not over you. They're not, someone you're trying to impress or need to perform for. It's just soul to soul.
Yes.
And I had almost no one in that place.
Yes.
And that's when I had to create an awareness of the need to foster intentionally relationships with people that didn't have complications to them. So that's my journey.
Yes.
So let's get back to yours and what you're kind of you're in seminary, you're becoming aware that a lot of your relationships are transactional or work related. What's the next thing for you?
I had a couple wake-up calls. My sister volunteered with me at the downtown campus.
Okay.
And she approached me a couple years after that, and she began to tell me what the experience was like being with me there. And she would use words like used. I always felt very used. And when you're in ministry, you're used to hearing negative feedback. You become kind of callous to it. But
Sure.
with her, it felt different because she's known me my whole life. So it didn't feel like just a frustrated volunteer. And I remember she said that to me, and we talked about it, and it just stuck with me, but I wasn't ready to process that. And what really hit me, this was just a few years ago, so I'm jumping ahead, then I'll jump back. There was a family that was very, very close to me, very, very close to me. When I think back on them, it's just one of those families at church. I don't know how to explain it, but the Lord almost gives them to you to cherish.
Yes.
And we would still stay in touch after I was no longer working at the church. They had transitioned to a different church. and they live in a gorgeous home on Bristol Mountain here in New York. And they invited me over just to see them and to catch up. And I remember the individual looked at me and she said, "Do you remember when we decided we were going to leave the church, that you walked me out to my car and you told me that we wouldn't be able to speak anymore?" She's like, "Do you remember that?" And I'm trying to be respectful towards this family, a very prominent family, if I can say it that way, in the community. And I actually didn't even remember it, but I believed it, because that's the zone I was in during that time.
And what was motivating you to share that? Was it a feeling like, well, they're walking away from me, I need them to know the consequences of what they're doing?
It was a sense that I had that the work of ministry required so much loyalty and focus that if you're not with me, you're against me, which I do not believe is the proper, in any way, theological view of that construct or idea. And when I was standing in their kitchen with them in this home that my wife and I just love so much, I just looked at her and I felt like I was repenting to her a couple years ago. I said, "I'm so sorry." And I began to share with her what my journey of relationships and friendship has been like since then, and a great work that the Lord's done in my life. So the redemptive process for me was seminary, and then it was Gordon MacDonald. So I'll try to share this briefly.
I love Gordon MacDonald.
Oh my goodness.
His book, Ordering Your Private World.
Yes.
I read it in probably 1986, and it became foundational for my life. But he himself had some work he needed to do.
And I think one of the most sacred parts of his story is the work that he did after that moral failure.
Yeah.
Because that became such a gift to the body of Christ, of him writing about his mistakes and his recovery. But in seminary, our professor, when we were doing the semester on biblical community, every semester we'd have to write a practical theology paper. So we'd have to spend 2 to 3 months living out what we were learning. And I actually, in my practical theology, I selected 2 or 3 people I was going to try to be friends with. Now keep in mind, this is only 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay.
So I'm in my mid-30s, and I remember praying and feeling ridiculous, saying, "Okay, Lord, who am I going to try to be friends with?" Sitting with my journal, "Okay, I guess I'll try my friend Jordan that I've known forever. I guess I'll try my friend Omari." I felt like a child. I guess I'll try. And then I had to schedule coffee with them. I had to think about what I was going to talk with them about without needing anything from them, like you had said. And to this day, Omari, my friendships with Omari and Jordan have kindled to become 2 of my closest friends. I speak with both of them every week. So that was part of that.
And these are not members of your church. You don't have an employment relationship with them or any kind of conflict. It's just
Yes.
colleagues or.
Well, Omari he sits on the advisory board for Love and Lead, a
Okay.
business that does the consulting, but and he has helped fund some things. He's a very successful business friend, but having grown in this view, somehow that's not impacting it like it would in the past.
Yeah.
So I'll just put that there. But with Gordon MacDonald, the Ordering Your Private World and the Resilient Life, and I interviewed him. We brought him in to speak once, and I was chaperoning him around town and was able to ask him a lot of questions and things like that. And Gordon shares a story that after he had his moral failure, he had this awakening around friendship. And I've asked him to speak on this at multiple things that I've held with some friends and different men's events. And he describes having this feeling and having this sense of no friendship, having experienced this failure, that he would invite men out for breakfast, and he was investigating which of these individuals really connect with my soul. Which of them do I feel like I can be very comfortable around? I have a psychologist would say that when you're with your closest friends, you actually feel alone, which sounds very confusing, but what he means by that is you don't feel like you have to impress anyone. You feel as comfortable as you would if you were sitting by yourself. So Gordon began to almost interview friends. And he landed with a group of men in his mid-40s that he would say to this day when he shares the story, several of them have passed away. Most of them are no longer in good health. But they remained his closest friends. They've traveled together. He tells stories of going to Switzerland, hiking together, and how they would plan trips in advance. And these friends became a bedrock for all that he would continue to do in ministry the rest of his life. And that became a very impressive dream for me that I'm now doing my best to build on.
So what were the next steps for you to realizing you had, first of all, a lot of your relationships were transactional ministry relationships,
Yes.
right? That you had a little bit of a distorted view of people being an end,
Yes.
a
Very
means
much.
to the
Yes,
end of
yes.
whatever the ministry goal was. That's a very common thing that we can fall into. I've fallen into it before, not intentionally, but you became aware of that.
Yes.
And then you became aware that you needed to have some real relationships in your tank, and you had to find them, create them, foster them. What is
Yes.
that like? What are some of the ways, if a pastor is watching or listening right now, it could be, and we don't just have men who are pastors, we have women who are pastors and leading
Yes.
in local churches. And I've heard this a lot from women in ministry as well. They feel alone. And I think some of this, and I just want to talk about this for a second, is related to the fact that when you are ministering to people and you're ministering with people, there are multiple levels of expectation, right?
Yes.
People need things from you. Sometimes what they need is an appropriate thing. Sometimes they need or want something from you that really you're not designed to give them, but that doesn't mean that they still don't expect it. And so as life goes on, and as you invariably cannot meet every need that they may place on you, they become disappointed.
Yes.
Pastors and ministers become de facto parents. And even though there is a spiritual fatherhood and motherhood in the pastorate, the fact is that you cannot be the real, actual father and mother of these people.
Right.
And whatever unresolved issues they have with their own, or whatever father wounds or father needs, mother wounds, mother needs they have, they get extrapolated often on the idealized pastor. So the pastor is going to be, and people, it's not like people sit down and think, okay, I'm going to make you my pastor, my father, my mother. You're going to give me what I didn't get. They don't think that way, but that's what, in essence, happens for them emotionally. They begin placing on the pastor, the associate minister, expectations to try to heal the wounds that they have in the
Yes.
deficits in their own lives. And invariably, they're setting you up for failure because there's no way. And you can get on the bandwagon of trying to be that for them. And I've done that.
Me too.
And invariably, you will fail them.
Yes.
Or you can recognize that's part of what's happening and provide for them what you can, but also try to be clear with them about what you can't be. And invariably, people are going to walk away disappointed. And when you have a number of those, and if you're in ministry for any period of time, you will have them.
Oh, yes.
How do you trust again? And so often when people leave, they want you to be discreet about all of their stuff. But often you become fodder for their conversation with other people. And so sheep can bite. Sheep can butt. Sheep can betray. Sheep wander. Sheep can disappoint. Sheep can attack. And after a while, you love the sheep, but you become it can become a very complicated relationship. And I think that's what can begin the isolation cycle for pastors and their spouses is this, I've taken so many hits, I have to protect myself. But what can happen is, if you're not walking through that process in a healthy way, you isolate. And you end up losing some of what makes you effective as a minister.
Yes.
Have you recognized that in your experience?
Well, you're hitting on something that's become very personal to me, because something that I found is as I was growing in my understanding, I would teach on relationships at church. We would have small group season launches, and I understood it in a general theological sense as I began to really understand friendship and relationship. And as that area of my life began to prosper, my work relationships, I found, became more professional. Because I could accept them for what they were, and I could celebrate them for what they were.
You weren't trying to make them into a friendship to meet your own personal
As the needs of my soul were being met properly as a man and as a Christ follower, I could sit with an employee and they could be disappointed with me, and I could drive home and call my wife and be at peace
Yeah.
because it was so much less personal for me. And I'm an Enneagram 8, so for people who follow Enneagram, relationships aren't always the easiest for me anyways, because my personality is a little bit more cut and dry, the way I process things.
Are you more of an introvert, would you say?
Excessively,
Yeah.
and through ministry at times medication was needed, because to be the proper pastor and to be as present as I needed to be in social settings, it felt impossible. So that was another thing that the Lord really had to, which was part of the thorn in my flesh that would also keep me close to Christ. So I don't want to say that in a negative light.
That's a very good point. These things that we talk about, it's not about being perfect, it's about being
Yes,
aware
yes.
of where you operate, maybe why you operate that way, and then mitigating, finding ways to balance yourself out in a way that's healthy.
But it feels like this conversation could be a whole other
yes.
session, because
It should be.
what was happening in my life when I was growing in my understanding of relationships, I began to all of a sudden become eager to understand a more professional, being a better executive. It was almost like removing that need to always be liked and to realize my only friends are people I'm working with caused me to feel more astute and strong, and I think like growing in wisdom, stature, and favor. I felt properly more planted in my pastoral position because I wasn't trying to pull something out of people working for me or people on the executive team. And I've had a mentor for many years at 12 Stone Church. Chris Huff is an incredible individual. Was there, began the church with Pastor Kevin Myers. And
12 Stone Church in Georgia?
Georgia, yes.
Yeah.
And Chris began to teach me over the years how they developed these processes, and he began to teach me language when I would meet with employees.
That's so important.
Yes, where
So important. Language. What do I say?
Chris would say to me, and it was all just coming at this beautiful time in my life with beginning to have friends, beginning to grow as an executive that wasn't trying to pull unnecessary things from these individuals that my soul needed. So Chris would say in the 12 Stone environment for a season, they would use language when they were meeting with an employee that worked for them, where they would say, hey, I need to put my supervisor hat on right now, and we need to talk about you being on time. If you're late again, I'm going to write you up, because our policy is that if you're late 3 times, you get written up. And then towards the end of the meeting, say, all right, I'm going to put my pastor hat on because I want to share with you something that I felt in my heart when I was praying for you this morning.
Yeah.
And then
So
say,
good. We do that here.
Yeah.
It's so good.
Now I'm going to put my executive hat on, and let's talk about the next 6 months of kids ministry and what's your ministry action plan. And I had, especially when I was meeting with millennials, people whose nature that I was experiencing we were always so excited, which I love creativity, so we'd always be sharing stories about what the Lord was doing. That language allowed me to lead them so much more effectively, or at least I felt like.
Are you a millennial?
On the right at the end, just snuck in,
Yeah.
so barely.
But you get and understand
Yes,
the particular unique traits that can be
yes,
present.
yes.
Yeah.
And the view of work. So all of that to say, part of how that's boiled into my work today, because what I do with Love and Lead, a lot of what it's ended up in the last couple of years is helping churches shape executive teams that mirror the leadership style of the senior pastor, but also develop HR processes that allow executive teams to focus and be professional when meeting with employees. Because when you have a large church that does not have a clear HR department, you end up having an executive team and a lead pastor that's absorbing all these personal and relational issues.
Right.
Which I think these are all, and the reason why I'm saying it, Pastor, is I believe we could add up all these things into an equation that lead to the isolated, lonely pastor.
Yep.
It is the lack of process,
Yep.
and it's the lack of good view of relationship. It could be a book, it's a resource.
So in some ways, in order to get healthy, you needed to define what those relationships were in your life and what was appropriate for those relationships. In some ways, what I'm hearing you say is you stopped needing certain things from the people that were working for you or the people you were working with, and it became, as you began to get those needs met in other healthy ways, Not just with the Lord, which we know the Lord
Yes.
meets our needs, right? But with people that could be with you and meet those other needs. Then it helped you to clarify the relationship, and you could be there for them. Now, what if somebody says, well, then you just made it a transactional relationship and and now it's just a business as usual? How would you respond to that?
I would respond that the reason why I know that's not true is that I look at some of my friends who are very successful, God-fearing executives outside of the church world, and they became mentors of mine. And I would listen to how they would work with their employees at universities and different places professionally in Rochester, and I would hear how endeared their employees were to them. And I realized these are individuals that deeply love Jesus, that are doing incredible work in the community, whose employees respect them and care for them and have worked for them for many years, but they're not expecting necessarily friendship from those employees, but they have wonderful work relationships with them. And in the church world, I had one or two people I did work with that were very close friends that I still hang out with to this day. But it removed that awkward tension from all the other one-on-ones in the meetings that I had to be that with other people. Right. And if I look at the timeline of my life, what happened, it began at the seminary work. It began with the challenge for me to experiment with continuing those friendships that came out of that final paper, which it did, having to schedule phone calls and remind myself to do things that felt very unnatural if I wasn't talking about work or something I needed from someone. As that was growing and developing, I began to notice me feeling more present in my church meetings. I began me feeling more healthy, even feeling more connected to Christ in some ways, because a part of my soul was being filled by Him outside of that environment.
So you brought structure, really, to a structural plan, which is kind of your bent anyway,
Yes.
But you just brought those natural thoughts and skills into your relationship world.
Which I didn't know was happening. I just knew that I was feeling more present in meetings.
Interesting.
I was feeling less angst, and I was feeling less lonely in ministry, and I was feeling more happy at home. And it's what Wayne and I, when we teach on it in retreat type settings, we call the theology of friendship. And he and I tell our story, and I tell my story around these types of things because we're primarily reaching pastors in those settings. Many of which, when we get them alone and we get them in the Adirondacks or when we're together in Montana, it's unbelievable the things that you hear.
Like what? I mean, without divulging anything inappropriate.
I remember one of the most emotional moments for me in the last few years, and this gentleman's become a very, very close friend of mine. We were together at a retreat for about 3 or 4 days, and we were making so many memories. So much time around the campfire. And there was one guy there that I'm guessing he's been in ministry for about 20 years, has a very large church, many staff, very prosperous church. It's been managed very well financially, just a wonderful place. And I was just kind of watching him. He'd have moments of laughing, and then he'd have moments of being very quiet. And it was the last day, and we were all around the table, and he made a comment that he only ever is alone by himself on his back porch. And he made a comment about he never has time like this with men. And leads a large, large church and is very well connected in his state in America. And I remember listening to him speak and hearing the tone of his voice and thinking to myself, oh my gosh, like what I've experienced the last 3 or 4 days, I have this back home. This individual is going to get on a plane and go back to a place where he'll have to wait 12 months to come back with us. He'll be counting down 12 months to be back into this room. And since then, I've watched him travel and hang out with some of the guys on that trip and get to know other people, and I can see this theology of friendship really prospering in his life. But that was an eye-opener for me that I need to continue to do better, and it's a burden for me to host opportunities in this season of my life where that magical moment can happen. To me, it's very spiritual because it's almost a moment of trauma that leads to an awakening for a man. I specifically host needs events for men currently to come to that awakening of, I can't do this well for a long time if something doesn't change in me. I'm going to mess up. Something's going to fall apart.
And how many times have we worked with pastors and leaders and who didn't have anywhere to go? And they stumbled into something. They began to fall, and they had nowhere to turn to get help without the fear of the loss of everything in their life. And a lot of times in conversing with people like that, people that have gone through those things, there was this precedent of loneliness, of isolation, of trying to do it on your own, and how the enemy uses that in the lives of ministers. I mean, can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I remember during COVID, my friend Wayne, Pastor Wayne, is extremely well connected around the country. And during COVID, he was hearing time after time of men making really poor decisions when their churches were shutting down. And we were talking, at times it felt like 2 or 3 times a week. We knew that churches were closing locations, and they were realizing, wow, we really can't afford these other 2 campuses anymore, so now we're going to 2 campuses versus 5. And so much moral failure was happening, not just with the quote-unquote famous ministers, but with ministers that were already hanging on by a thread.
Yeah. A lot of these folks, let's face it, there's the big personalities, the lead pastors, but
Yes.
there's a lot more pastors, shepherds, who are serving in churches on teams that are supporting that senior pastor. And often the senior pastor gets a lot of the attention, but these other shepherds that are doing the work of the Lord, sometimes their needs are the last ones that are met.
Yeah, and just in this season of my life, I feel like I'm connecting with more pastors now than I did when I was working full-time at a church. And the amount of times I'm sitting with a minister who's telling me how badly they want to quit, but their church is so successful.
Isn't that interesting?
It's unbelievable.
Because there are people that are listening and they're thinking, some of our pastor friends are thinking, if I could just be successful.
Yes.
Give me the principles to grow a large, successful, visibly powerful and important church, right? And that's we want
lie.
those externals. And part of that is our westernized American church growth
That's such a lie.
thing we've bought into in the last 40 years. But that actually doesn't guarantee that you're going to be happy or contented.
Yeah, and we've all heard these kinds of things, but the version of you that you are right now will be so much darker and isolated as your church grows if you don't change. Yeah.
Say that again.
The lonely person who refuses to get a therapist, who refuses to confess. And I can tell you something, Pastor, this is just coming to mind. When I began to realize how much brokenness in me hadn't been confessed, Pastor Pierre always provided his ear to me, but he was still my boss.
Of course.
So there was parts of me that just hadn't been exposed in so long. And there was a gentleman who, when I was really desperate and I was looking for more friends, I'm just being very candid, I felt like the Lord brought a person to mind because I was praying. Actually, one day I was backstage at church and I was scrolling through my contacts, and I actually asked the Spirit of God to illuminate someone, which sounds really wild and interesting, but I was that desperate. I was like, Jesus, please, let somebody bounce off my phone.
Yeah.
And somebody did. I believe the Lord answered that prayer, and it was a random text, hey, JT, could we grab coffee? That's how desperate I was.
So you're going through your contacts, and this name comes up, and
Yes.
you feel like this is the person.
Yes, true story.
Wow.
And I remember, like, my mind took a picture of that day backstage. So now I'm aware I have this need. I have a couple friends. Jordan had moved away. Omari was close, but I knew something in my soul needed more. I met up with JT. It turned out that he went back to school for his master's degree in mental illness. So he had been studying emotions and breakdown. Wow. True story. And we met at a Starbucks on Mount Hope Avenue in Rochester, and he was in the corner, and I had to sit facing him the first 5 or 6 times we met because I just cried hysterically the whole time. He sat there, and I just faced him, crying hysterically probably the first 5 or 6 times we met. And every time somebody was sit adjacent to me, I looked like my mom died or something, like,
Wow.
Um,
And I know for you, that is not an easy thing. That's
No.
not, you're not a crier. You're not a
No.
emotionally, you're not an expresser. And
it was all, and this is what I see right now, and as the Lord is giving me more and more proximity to ministers, particularly people leading larger churches, is they don't realize that there's this ice that has to be broken. They've grown to live with that ice.
Yep.
They don't even know what's under there. They don't know how many thoughts they've suppressed with disappointment in themselves and other people, in their marriage, in their sex life, it's all just under there. They've actually surrendered any sense of hope that anything under there can be redeemed, restored, fixed.
Because the machine of ministry
machine.
demands you must feed it.
And who can really know what's under there?
And what is under there? What if I open that up?
Yes.
Then how will I?
Yeah.
I don't even want to think about if I look at that stuff.
Yes. So the risk that I felt, to be having these conversations, and looking back on it, it's just amazing. It felt so risky. But that's part of the dilemma. It's part of the bubble we create too, is we just view ourselves as almost being almost too important.
Yeah.
It's like this weird thing that happens. But the risk that I felt, which some of it was real, some of it had just become almost self-inflated, sitting in that Starbucks just saying, confessing the real depression, the real anxiety of what was happening in my soul, was a heck of a thing. But the freedom that it began to lead to, and even in ministering to others, and I can say this talking with you and those listening, because I know that, assuming they have a similar theology, is I began to feel more comfortable ministering spiritually. I began to feel that the Lord could move through me with more ease.
Right.
I felt less striving and teaching. It was almost like as I was allowing these things to come to the surface, I could be more naturally me when I was eager for the Spirit of the Lord to move through me. That's what I began to experience in the corporate context.
Wow. So, Chris, when we talk about this, and I know a lot of folks are listening, pastors, team members. We also have church members that are listening, that are just curious, maybe want to understand better what it's like to be a pastor or shepherd, and some of the things we face. What are some first steps a pastor can take to begin breaking out of that isolation or begin addressing these things in their life? I mean, we've laid a lot out there, but what are some simple steps a person can take from your perspective?
Yeah, if I think through some of the more recent conversations, and as ministers, we've become such experts at so many things, and counseling, it can feel so elementary when I'm going to say it can seem silly. But the beautiful thing is I'm having these conversations with men leading very large churches with multi-million-dollar budgets. And at times the conversation is as simple as, can you think back to an individual that you would talk to that would make you feel safe? And I've sat with people where they'll think back 15 years ago, and they'll say, oh yeah, I used to lead a church in Idaho, and there was a family there that we would go over their house for dinner. If you were to call that individual, do you think they would talk to you? Oh yeah, they send me Christmas cards and stuff. What would you think about reaching out to them and having a phone call and telling them how you're doing? So it can begin as basic as that.
Yep.
A lot of times there is struggle in marriage, so I'll ask that I'm a little distracted because I'm thinking of a very personal situation with a friend right now. Something that I'm realizing is that very few of my pastor friends have pastors. When I tell you this is such a thing, and if they have pastors, they're pastors that pastor their leadership. They're not pastoring their life.
Their soul, yeah.
They pastor their decisions. In some way, they work for them. They're not they don't have individuals in their life that they can say, hey, my wife and I haven't had sex in 2 months, and I'm afraid, I don't know what's going on. Like, who are they going to say that to?
Right.
Which I'm using as an example, which could seem wild for people watching, but to me, this is normal.
And if you have
conversations
maybe a pastor that's your credentialer or someone that you're accountable to on a functional work life, you got to be careful what you say, right?
Of course.
Because you don't want to be misunderstood. You also don't want to endanger your family if you share a struggle.
Yes.
So a pastor, this is really important, and I've come to see this in my own life. You need to have someone that needs nothing from you, that you need nothing from in terms of your work, but they're just there for you. They're your shepherd.
And I'll just say this to you, Pastor, when you first told me about the Shepherd's Network, and anyone hearing this who knows me knows my heart is not to make a pitch. I'm not a good pitch maker. When you first told me about the Shepherd's Network, all I could think about were my friends and people I know that need to get on an airplane and come to anything that happens with this, because they don't have pastors. And anytime they get invited to something where there's people they can be around that provide that sort of association to them, they'll go to. But they're afraid because now they lead large churches, they have elder boards, they have business boards. They don't know who to even say that to.
Yeah.
There's no webpage you can go to find a pastor. So that is also a process that I walk some of my friends through, is let's talk about that. Who could provide you with spiritual covering? It's okay if they can't speak to every detail of your gigantic budget. Right. It's okay if they don't have an MBA. Who would your wife feel comfortable speaking to? Like, give me a couple that both of you feel comfortable just being yourselves and talking about struggle with kids or grandkids or young kids, old kids, whatever it looks like.
Pain, fear, disappointment, all of that.
When I say this is a deficit, I would say, not exaggerating, 8 or 9 out of 10 pastors that I connect with, they don't have a pastor.
Wow.
Easily. So that's why the Shepherd's Network to me is not just something interesting.
Yeah.
We're desperate.
We're desperate.
For God-fearing networks that have great theological foundations and an understanding of large church leadership to be active.
And so actually, I've asked you to come in and help consult with me to build the Shepherd's Network. And we're right now in the middle of putting together a plan to really not just take this podcast and leverage it fully as a resource, but to build out this place where ministers, pastors and shepherds and their teams who are called to the shepherding work can connect in a safe way, can get resources, and can get relationships that they need. And we're talking about having roundtables and conferences and all sorts of things, but it all starts with just recognizing I need something in my life. Lord, help me to find other people that I can be a shepherd with, not shepherd, but I can be myself with, that understand. This is important. And this is something I've seen over the years. You can get into accountability groups or small groups with leaders, right? Other leaders, and there's something valuable when a pastor sits with a business leader, with a political leader, with a small business leader, and just kind of fellowship. But the reality is this: none of them get you.
It's different.
They can't possibly know what
different.
Local church ministry is. The sheep don't know. They don't get it. And they can't, because there is a spiritual weight. There is a spiritual responsibility.
It's different.
There's a spiritual opposition that pastors face that no other person faces in the same way. Because the local church is Jesus' idea to change the world, and the local church is the thing that Satan hates the most. So shepherds need care, and we need to be strong together. And that's part of what we hope to build with the Shepherd's Network.
Yeah, in Gordon MacDonald's Resilient Life, which is, I would recommend everyone listening to this should read Resilient Life.
Resilient Life.
The Resilient Life. It's really about properly building a plan for the second half of life. And I mean, I'm 43.
Well, I'm going to get that book.
Yeah, I'm 43, so I'm in the beginning of my second half of life. When I think of the things that I desire to be closely associated with in the second half of my life, it's things like the Shepherd's Network. Because we have so many networks out there right now, which are good, but they are providing wonderful leadership constructs because many talented ministers have ended up with churches larger than they thought they would.
Right.
So thank the Lord that the church's heart is now open to that.
Sure.
But one of the things that my professor said in the first semester we were in seminary, he said one of the saddest things happening in the church world today is that congregants are coming to their pastors with deep heart biblical questions and they're getting leadership answers.
Right.
They're not getting answers that are being guided in anchored doctrine and proper theology.
You're pushing my button. The old school, what a pastor is.
Yes.
You counsel, you share, all of the old school stuff about the pastoral ministry, lost.
So
we delegate all that to small groups.
that's it. So a
lot of pastors can talk and they can lead, but they can't really do the shepherding role that they need to do.
So what I love about the Shepherd's Network, and I hope that the Shepherd's Network becomes an inspiration to other pastors to build similar networks.
Yeah, amen.
Because what draws me to it, having sat in so many network meetings in so many different places, from the west to the east coast of the United States, the Shepherd's Network is going to offer brilliant understanding of leading a large church or leading a church. I know it will, because Abundant Life is an incredibly well-ran church. But what it will provide is this theological framework. And it will help pastors answer those questions that I do have some pastor friends that are answering those questions well. But I also know a lot of pastors that would be, just as I was before this last run in seminary, feel too insecure theologically to even confess that.
That's very good.
So thank the Lord for all that's to come.
And I want to thank you, Chris, for the conversation today. It's been great. I'm sure that everybody that is with us, that's listening or watching, if you're a shepherd, a pastor, a church leader, some of this is resonating with you. And next steps, Chris said it, this is something that I did a few years ago. I felt very isolated and alone. I had a lot of big decisions to make, and I was on a sabbatical. And as I began my sabbatical 2 years ago, I sat down and said to myself, who are the people that I know I could call if I needed to? Because when you're in crisis or in trouble, you feel isolated, you feel like you're all alone. And I just went through my life and I wrote down a list of about 12 people. I call them my lifelines. And they're not all local. In fact, most of them aren't. But they're people that I know, some of them from college, some of them I've known from ministry over the years, that I could call them at any time and ask them for help, counsel, or just to be a listening ear. And I know they would do it without judgment and that they would be there for me. And just having that list, I have it on my computer, my lifelines. Every now and then I go and look at these folks and I say, when's the last time I talked to them? And I began to intentionally reach out on a regular basis to my lifelines just to foster those things. And it was an amazing step to help me not feel so isolated, because often we do have relationships that are there that we just haven't thought about. And we haven't asked for what we need from some of the people that God's placed in our life. So I want to encourage you to begin thinking this way, moving this way. And listen, the Shepherd's Network is just being built. This podcast is the first step. And we have a lot of things that we're planning that we hope will be a blessing to your life. There are going to be links you can click on in the show notes, but I want to invite you to subscribe, and share this. Share this especially with pastors and ministry leaders that you feel this is going to help. And as we continue to build this out, if you go to theshepherdsnetwork.com, you can actually sign up for our mailing list, give us your information, your name, and we'll put some of this up on the screen if you're watching. And just let us know who you are and what's happening in your life so that we can then begin to give you updates as we build this out. Again, we're just starting this, so it's a new adventure, but we'd love to have you on the journey with us, and we'd love to be there for you to provide relationships, resources, and renewal for your work as a shepherd in the local church. Chris, thanks so much. It's been great to have you, and until we talk to you again, may the Lord bless you abundantly. Have a great day.
Thanks for joining us on the Shepherds Podcast. For more episodes and resources, you can check out our YouTube page or our website at theshepherdsnetwork.com.